focus on the post-war period. And I'm the youngest person in this panel, and it feels great because I can actually talk to my subjects, like Gunnar Hökmark. By sheer will, and by what we in Swedish call ett jävlar anamma, the Monday movement was organized to lobby the Swedish government, and finally independence came. And then Sweden assumed what I like to call its former role as a key player over the Baltic Sea. Because history matters. 80 years of war and occupations matters far less than 1,000 years of lively cooperation across the sea. Many Swedes, when we refer to our old universities, tend to say Uppsala and Lund. They completely forget that Sweden's second oldest university was the University of Dorpat, present-day University of Tartu, founded by the then Governor-General Johan Skytte. And I read recently that they have renamed their Department of Political Science, the Johan Skytte Institute. It really doesn't work in English because it tends to be the shitty institute. And it was far easier to attend Dorpat than if you lived in the south of Sweden than it was to attend Uppsala University, because there is a short trip across the sea, but then traveling by land all the way up to Uppsala was quite complicated and dangerous. And I see I'm soon running out of time, but I was going to say that if you only get remember one thing I said, and one thing from this panel discussion, is the fact that history matters, cooperation matters, making mistakes can have historical connotations, like the fact that when Sweden completely ignored the Soviet Union's occupation of the Baltic countries. And word matters. I recently realized that Estonia was celebrating its Independence Day. And then I thought, well, is it independence from 91? Of course not. It was from the founding of the Republic in 1917. Because one thing we should never do is to recognize the Soviet occupation, because that was illegal. Was unlawful. And therefore it's a great honor to be here, because I sense that in my capacity as a writer of books about dead old men and an editorial writer, I can do my little effort to try to encourage the Swedish readers on Närkes Allehanda to realize that history matters, and we have far more in common than we think with Estonia, Lithuania, with the three Baltic countries.
Latvia.
And Latvia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that leads naturally then to our next speaker, who was mentioned here in David's intervention.
You haven't aged a day.
There we go.
That's how I feel as well. Thank you very much, and thanks for arranging this event. I think, sitting here and looking out here and thinking about the times what we're talking about, if to have an historic perspective, one should not underestimate the fantastic and miraculous fact that we are where we are. We are just now in Europe talking a lot of the difficult times we're changing. The number of different crises. I saw a photo of myself earlier here on a demonstration outside the Soviet embassy. And if you take that time span from how Europe was in those times and how it is today, it is a tremendous... you see, it's me?
Yes.
It's a tremendous change. And I would like also to not only thank the organizers here, but especially as the Swedish Estonians are celebrating 60 years, to extend not only congratulations but also thanks to all of you, of course your friends from Latvia and Lithuania, because I think you gave Sweden an understanding about the difference between democracy and dictatorship. You can read it in the theories, but you were in some way an import to us of understanding what it really means. That when you don't have it, it's not only a matter of highbrow speeches, it's a matter of brutal reality. And I think this is an extremely important understanding from history if we are to learn something. I think an important point just to touch upon is that the Baltic Sea region, as we see here, it is the most competitive economic cluster in the world. It's one of the best integrated parts of Europe. A lot of the things we are trying to do in European Union is working here. Financial industry, newspaper, media, insurance, forestry, and whatever it is, are much more integrated in this part of Europe than in any other part. It brings forward a competitiveness. This does also mean that we are very much, and you can go back, and David touched upon it, you can go back in history when you have seen the same pattern, but it's in some way much more dynamic in these days. And it means that we are bound together in peace, but that's why we're also bound together facing all the threats we are facing. An historical reflection is that we are very much and very often talk about post times, post-war times, post-Cold War, post-World War II or post-whatever. But we are much less discussing pre-times, pre-war times. And from a pure mathematical analysis, I think it's important to line out that there are just, in history, there are just as many pre-war times as post-war times, maybe -1. And this is extremely important because our thinking and analysis are rooted in the post-times attitudes and analysis. We are not seeing and not understanding the pre-war challenges. And my point is that having a pre-war perspective does not mean that you say it is doomed to be a war. You can avoid it. And there is nothing better in security policy, defense policy, policy whatever, to avoid war. And that is the thing you can do in the pre-war times. In the post-war times, it's too late. You can regret it, you can say you should have a lot of things different, but it's much better to do it different in the pre-war times. And now we see there is a broad spectrum of threats facing us, from disinformation, destabilization, cyber war, cyber activities, economic warfare, and warfare in Ukraine. It is going on, so it's not a distant threat. It is going on just now. A lot of the discussions about the outcome of the election in France are rooted in this fact. So I think, and I will stop here, I think we need to have, in order to safeguard what we have achieved here in the Baltic Sea, but also safeguard what we have achieved in Europe, and also in order to make that influence other parts of the world, we need to develop the best possible pre-war time perspectives in order to avoid the war and secure the peace. Thanks.
For that interesting remark, and that will move us on to Ilmar Metsalu, who will do the last intervention, or before we have the discussion. I will also give the word to Hans-Jürgen.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me here. In my short introduction, I will focus on the year 1991 in Finnish foreign policy. I would state that there were three key elements in Finnish foreign policy that year. First one was the economic integration to the West. Sweden had already stated in 1990 its intentions to become a member in European Community, and Finland was struggling with how to react to this. Secondly, there was the instability in the Soviet Union. The conservative forces were gaining more ground, and this was threatening Mikhail Gorbachev's position. And despite that the Berlin Wall had fallen and the Cold War was over, Finland still had the agreement of friendship, cooperation and mutual assistance with the USSR. Also, the troop withdrawals from the Central Europe meant that suddenly there were a lot of troops near the Finnish borders. And then the third element was the Baltic crisis, which I will soon focus. At this point, the relations between the East and the West were better than for a long time. This allowed Finland to move more freely in her foreign policy. From Finland's point of view, the international relations were good, mostly because of Mikhail Gorbachev. President Mauno Koivisto had been in correspondence with him, and he was pleased with Gorbachev's politics in the late 1980s. Unlike the previous Soviet leaders, he had also recognized Finland as a neutral country in 1989. However, the Baltic independence movements were sort of messing things up from the Finnish point of view. First, they were seen weakening Gorbachev, and this would threaten all the good things he had accomplished in the Soviet Union. Second, the Estonians could watch the Finnish television. President Koivisto feared that if the situation escalated, this would have an effect in the Baltic states, and to be dragged into a conflict certainly was not in Finland's interests. And third, if there would be violence in the Baltic states, it would be just 80 kilometers south of Finland. So, when the popular fronts were forming in the Baltic states in the late 1980s, the Finnish Foreign Ministry had a pretty good picture on what was going on there, especially in Estonia. The activity was seen as nationalistic by its nature from the very beginning. Finland was financially supporting the self-determination movements in Estonia, and this was done behind the smokescreen of cultural cooperation. The official foreign policy doctrine was that Finland supported the Baltic self-determination because it was a part of Gorbachev's perestroika. The inconsistency in the Finnish foreign policy was clear, both supporting the Baltic self-determination and Gorbachev, but the Finnish foreign ministry hoped that Moscow was too busy to notice it. After the violence in Vilnius and Riga in January 1991, the Finnish foreign policy was criticized both internationally, especially here in Sweden, and also nationally. In the spring of 1991, the foreign ministry saw three possible scenarios for the Baltic crisis. The first and most likely one was a frozen conflict. Neither side would back down, and there would be tension and occasional violence. It could take years to get any progress in the negotiations. The second option was that Moscow might try to force a solution regardless of the international opinion. This would provoke resistance and maybe even armed resistance. And third option was that the negotiations between the Baltic governments and Moscow would continue, but this was seen highly unlikely. The Baltic claims for independence were seen justified and they were supported, but the Baltic approach for gaining the independence was seen completely unrealistic. Some kind of autonomy would be possible, maybe even independence in a decade or so. but in any case there would be military cooperation between the Baltic states and Moscow. But then came the coup in August 91, which solved many problems from the Finnish point of view. First and foremost, suddenly the Baltic states were not the problem anymore, because Finland could now openly support their independence. And secondly, the coup showed that Boris Yeltsin held the real power in Moscow. The failure of Yanayev's junta had shown that the Russian Democrats were a stronger force than the conservatives. After the failed coup, the foreign ministry concluded that the collapse of the Soviet Union was only a matter of time. From this point onward, the security threat to Finland was not a strong eastern neighbor, but a weak one. A civil war, possibly with even nuclear weapons, was seen as a realistic scenario. However, the Baltic crisis had solved in a surprisingly bloodless way compared to the pessimistic analysis of the Finnish Foreign Ministry. I would like to end by stating that studying the post-Cold War history is not only interesting but also important. Our dear eastern neighbor, Russia, is actively using its own implications of the post-Cold War history to justify its actions. And I would state that it's in all of our common interest to study the so-called post-Cold War world order and how it formed. Thank you.
Before we continue, I would just like to return to Hans-Jürgen to
maybe just from
things.
This discussion, 3 very short points. As historian, of course, I also agree history matters, but it also shows sometimes developments go wrong, and sometimes, in any case, they take some time. So our task is to keep strategic and sustainable view of what we want. I think that's very important, and if it has to be containment for a certain time, be it containment, but we should keep up with the dialogue. Second, I completely agree also with Hein and Gunnar. The situation is in a actually good, this region is actually in a very good situation. It is a cluster of competitive economy, of innovation, digitalization, and so on. And we should go on working on this and developing the region even further. And those who don't participate in this region now, they will one day realize that they are making an enormous mistake. The third, and we also see this region as very important from the economic point of view. And in Berlin we will have on the 13th, 14th of June the Baltic Sea Strategy Summit, simply talking about these topics of innovation and economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You already wanted to join in there, so I'll just let it flow.
I have a reflection on the Kaliningrad area, which you addressed also in your speak. I would just ask you to elaborate a bit more. Because I was a visiting professor at the University of Kaliningrad some 10 years ago. I stayed there for a while, and the last evening, 2 older colleagues invited me for a drink, as they said, and they drove me out to the coast, where they had a village which was just taken over by the Red Army in 1944-45. They hadn't let any politroops into it, so they just kept it like those German villages were in those days. We had lots to eat and lots to drink, and then I asked them finally, good colleagues, tell me, what will become of you here in Kaliningrad? Because then Kaliningrad had its first civilian as governor, not these terrible military with this terrible caps. What will become of you? As I see, you have the chance to maybe become like a Baltic state, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. That would be one option. The other one would be, as the students tell me, that Königsberg would join Germany again and join the West again. And the third option would be maybe more intimate contact with Moscow. And then the colleagues looked at each other, and then the older one said to me, dear colleague, you must know, here in Kaliningrad, 15% of our students study English.
17% study German. The rest of our students study Kalashnikov. And it hasn't grown any better since then, has it?
Well, I'm not the up-to-date Kaliningrad expert anymore, so I have not been there for some time, and but I can agree it has not developed as we had hoped for. Of course, there was a time when the more young people from Kaliningrad traveled to Lithuania and Poland and to motherland Russia. I think we are, you mentioned the word containment, we have to see how things develop, and I don't think that the people of Kaliningrad are happy about these developments now. 17 years ago we were starting to have ideas. Well, we had parts of one country which left the EU, like Greenland left the EU. Why should there not be a small part of one country joining the EU? So those were the years, the ideas 17 years ago. We are not there now, but I am confident if we follow our policy line, if we stick to our values, keep them up, if we have a clear security position, it is up to Russia, which will have to change its policy. And I lived in the Soviet Union in the mid-80s. Never would I have expected the Soviet Union to fall down or the wall and so on. History is also full of mysteries. So.
If I can relate to that, because as Hein points out, in containment, yes. On the other hand, we've heard the history of civil society contacts, network, and the importance of people's movements. And that is also often mentioning sometimes as for state representative as something that could happen while we cannot have the same contacts at state level. But how do you see the role of civil society in improving relations or reducing the security challenges in the region based on the history of these movements?
Well, what I said also in my speech, of course, I think we have to see that we, at a sub-political level, have to try to keep up organizations, keep them alive, which get the civil society meeting and staying there. I opened the Euro faculty in Kaliningrad, and I think that was important also for the students to get people from Estonia, from other Baltic countries, to teach them, to tell them of their ideas. And we have really to try to find institutions which help us to keep up this dialogue, especially also with Kaliningrad, but not also.
Gunnar?
I think that an important way of understanding of how things are going on is that, first of all, history didn't end yesterday. But with that follows as well, history doesn't end today either. And the big surprise, it will not end tomorrow. It will continue. And what we have seen in history is, and it might sound highbrow or poetical or whatever, but it's always ideas that are making the change. There is an old phrase, some say it's Mao, and I'm not very much to quoting Mao, but if he said it, or I don't remember just now, every country has an army, either your own or another one. But also you can apply that to the more ideological shift. Every society has an idea, either your own or someone else. And I think a crucial base for the long-term development, if we, so to say, we are looking back sometimes 25 years, which is quite a short time, very short time. So we can also look forward for 25 years, and then it gets thrilling. I mean, well, I would say only looking forward in these days, 1 month ahead is thrilling, but 25 years, yes, exactly. What will happen in 25 years? Well, I'm quite sure that the change during these years to come will be dependent on whose ideas are the strongest. And in that sense, because that is crucial for civil society contacts, I think we must not miss one thing that was crucial in the 80s, and that it was a time of strong belief in market economy, democracy and freedom. We were not talking very much about protectionistic agendas, or we were not talking about authoritarian leaderships, etc. We were talking about freedom, rule of law, democracy and market economy. Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians who came over here, they studied these things and they wanted to learn and wanted to be part of it. And the courage we saw in all these countries and a lot of other countries were based upon a strong belief in strong values. So I need, if we are to change in the right direction, we need to understand the importance and the impacts of the ideas.
David?
It's interesting when you say civil society, because, I mean, the cooperation compared to history has not been as lively for a long time between Sweden and the Baltic countries. In Sweden, it's incredibly difficult to get into medical school. So what do? You go to Riga or you go to Vilnius. Stockholm School of Economics we have here in Stockholm. You have the business school in Riga that was founded by the late Staffan Burenstam Linder. It's ranked higher in some cases than Stockholm School of Economics. And it's also the fact my generation, we go on a cruise. I mean, Tallinn is one of the most, I recently figured this out, Tallinn is one of the most popular destinations for stag parties. Because it's cheap and it's interesting, and in this case, I mean, when people go there and people are used to go across the sea as a normal tourist destination. My father's born in 1949, he still thinks it's amazing you can go to Riga as a normal tourist destination. Because in his days, when he was my age, you needed visas, you had guards, and they went on with Kalashnikovs to search, then no one followed you out. So, I mean, from stag parties to medical education, I mean, civil society and civil cooperation is doing quite well. And I was over there and I met a Danish entrepreneur who started a tech company. He used to be at Stanford, but it's far better to be in Estonia. Why? Because people are more driven, people find results, and people are more knowledgeable. So in that sense, it's going well. I think it's on the political end. That is where we have a problem, because when you give, as Gunnar said, every society has an idea. When you give people freedom, market economics, the rule of law, they tend to like it. Yeah.
I would like to add to Mr. Linde's point that when now it's completely normal to, for example, travel to Tallinn, even though we don't tend to go there for stag parties, but for other obvious reasons from Finland. The memory of a generation is quite short. And then, if you don't remember the history, then you don't value the most important things. For example, 70 years of peace in Europe. And if you don't remember that there has been also war in Europe, you don't value the obvious things that are important.
I would like to, I think we will come back to this perhaps at the end, but I would like to open the floor also for questions from the audience. If there is anyone, please raise your hand and introduce yourself. And there should be a microphone available. I have one gentleman here. Is there a microphone? Here we go. So please speak in the microphone also, because this is being broadcasted. Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello. My name is Per Lindström. I'm writer of not scientific books on Baltic history that is used in study circles and for tourists. And it's, again, it's 60 pages of history and then the double of normal tourist information, though with a very strong historic version of it. Anyhow, I was talking to Leif Kihlstrand, is that name correct? Kihlström? Kihlsten, thanks. At a conference, he is dead now, but he was a very interesting person to talk to, and I talked to him at the breakfast at a conference 10-15 years ago, and raising questions similar to those we're speaking about here. And he said that when you sit an evening together with high Russian militaries, and you drink quite a lot of vodka together, late in the evening you get quite some interesting personal views from those persons. And he said, generally they speak about the Baltic states as something that belongs to us, no discussion, they say. But he'd never heard anybody say this about Finland. And why? Because it wasn't Russian or Sovietic during their life. So in many respects, this is a question of generations to come, and to keep a workable situation until new generations have taken over. That's just a remark.
Thank you. Per. And in the back there, you take another one. And if there is anyone else, please raise your hand now and we'll collect. And then also, yes, Anita, thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Red Martinsen, and I am a member of the Estonian World Congress from Toronto, Canada. And I'd like to refer to back to some remarks that Mr. Hookmark made. You mentioned that it's whose ideas are the strongest that is of utmost and of great importance. And I agree. However, I think one of the things that we haven't really heard too much about today from you, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about, is how these ideas are communicated these days. We know from the vast disinformation campaign that has been launched by Russia, by Putin's Russia across the world, that ideas are being distorted. We have alternate facts, having seen this very strongly, of course, in the United States recent elections, and in Europe, in the Baltic region, and in other countries where it's also happening. And we heard about containment, and I think that a lot of what has really been happening, and containment, I guess, in a sense, implies a reaction rather than being proactive in a sense. So my question is, what more can be and should be done other than sanctions, and particularly with regards to the disinformation and the cyber warfare, which really has no historical precedent that is currently being waged by Putin's Russia.
Thank you. Yes, and then the lady in the red over here. You have the microphone, thank you. Yes, please.
Okay. My name is Ralevi. I'm a biologist, and my mother's father was also a biologist, and he was fighting in the Estonian War for Freedom. And no one of us has any interest in war. But I was wondering about what you heard Mark talk about, of this pre-analysis. Who will do this? I mean, who will make this analysis?
Thank you. Okay, I think we go back to the panel, and you can please comment shortly if you wish. Go from Ilmar and down. What more can be done on fighting for the ideas of our societies in light of Russian disinformation ongoing campaigns, for instance? Also with regard to cyber, and who will do the analysis of the pre-war situation that we are perhaps in?
Short remark on the notion that the Soviet officers don't consider Finland to be as one of the Baltic states. I would state that Paasikivi-Kekkonen line of understanding the Soviet foreign policy to a certain point had its base in Mannerheim line, that was the bunker line during the Second World War. So it's also important to have the notion of history, and also that it's also studied in Russia.
Thank you.
Thanks. First, regarding who will do the fight for the ideas, and the reply to that is we need all to do it. But I think in order to be able to do it and to be successful in doing it, we need to clarify that there is a conflict. Because as long as people, whoever people are, it's a nebulous phrase, but as long as we tend to believe there is no conflict about democracy and freedom, then it's always referred to as some sort of ideological discussion up in the air. But I think, therefore, we have a responsibility, all of us, to look out in the world as it is today. Ukraine. There is a war going on in Ukraine. We have a war in Europe. But we have also warfare on a number of other levels in Europe. Disinformation, destabilization. The energy policy of Putin is a strategy. That it was the theme for his doctoral thesis. We have all these things going on now. It's not threats in the future. It is going on in the minutes as we speak here, on different levels and a very broad spectrum. And that's why we need to clarify. I think fake news and disinformation is nothing new. I mean, in the 80s we had the so-called peace movement, there were representatives of different fractions of communist parties and socialist groups, etc. They brought along a lot of people with them, but it was huge disinformation. But we need to create clarity, and debate is the only way to create clarity. And we know all the think tanks and all the Adenauer-Stiftungen and all other things we can mobilize in order to do this. That is the core of our main business. And regarding how things will develop in Russia, I think looking at this map here, there is one country in this neighborhood that is not what we normally talk about as part of the Baltic Sea region. That is Russia. And Russia is the country in this region who is having the worst prospects for the future. It is a shrinking economy, rapidly. It is entering different sorts of crises, and Putin's way of dealing it with is different of repression or advantages abroad. But it's a shrinking economy. How can we do the pre-war analysis? Well, I could say, how do we do the post-war analysis? It's more a matter of where do we look? And talking about history is important, but it is, I think you, Mr. Ambassador, said that we shall learn from history if we do it the right way, and that's the solution I always prefer. But that's very right. We shall not bring history with us, but we shall learn from it and direct us to the future, understand that the threats we saw in the past are maybe different in the future, but they are still there, and we need to understand them, and we need to be clear about them, and just to see the threats in the present is good enough, and then also how they can materialize in to a bigger extent in the future as well. So we need to look upon the future and discuss the threats and opportunities, and they're all there.
Yes, thank you.
First one on the generations, I completely agree. It was in Ukraine in 2008 to 2012, and I always said we need one more generation. Ukraine is fragile, we need one more generation, at least 20 years, and then even in Donetsk people will be Ukrainian. Spoke a lot with students at university there. They were all on the way, but it was still a bit too far off, too many old thinking. And as to pre-situation, of course, one lesson we didn't learn was, of course, the Russian-Georgian War. There were several reasons to this war. It was not only Russia, but let's say, all in all, our countries did not react enough. We, from German side, opened up the Consulate General in Donetsk and did more in Crimea. But of course, that wouldn't have changed, it didn't change anything. But I think we now are more aware that we don't live in a world with the Russia we had hoped for, but with the Russia as it is, and so this will make things different. And to the point of cyber, I think we are addressing this issue, and at least in Germany, we are creating an enormous new warfare department and our Ministry of Defense on cyber, supporting the Baltic states on the disinformation side. But at the same time, I wouldn't only be defensive. I'm completely convinced in our values, and we should not think these authoritarian systems. Look at Erdogan, he's creating his own problems. We should be active and strategically following our line, our values, and I'm simply convinced of that. Thank you.
Any comments to your questions?
I have an idea. We have an institution in Sweden called Svenska Institutet, the Swedish Institute. This institute provides lectureships for Swedish and Swedish culture at foreign universities all over the world, more or less. And I heard some years ago that there was a new Swedish institute or Swedish lectureship at the University of Minsk. And when I asked, do we have one at the University of Kaliningrad? I'm coming back to Kaliningrad again. Then the answer was no. But the idea would be, I would say, to use state, federal money just to be offensive with these ideas, with knowledge, but not only with history, but with Western minds and thinking, also east of the Baltic Sea, and maybe offer Swedish lectureships, for instance, to the University of Kaliningrad and other universities, and to be more active in this area. I think on an academic level, that would be a very good step, because as we know, Putin is very suspicious of these NGOs and so on, but at the academic level, I think that would be easier to put through.
Thank you.
Professor Rebas tends to come back to Kaliningrad, and I tend to go back to Gunnar Hökmark. About the info war and what needs to be done. As Gunnar once said, I remember this very vividly, if we all convince one person, we grow double in our cause. It's the fact that we need a counter-narrative. I mean, these Twitter trolls, they might be trolls, but they are real. And there is an information war going on. And I mean, Putin has perfected what I like to call politics by bullying. I mean, the fact that Swedbank, the internet transfers in Estonia was disturbed, you kidnapped the border guard, and it's not open warfare, but it's politics by bullying. I mean, you poke, and poke to provoke an aggression. And we have seen this before. And it's also regarding hence we need accountability. Hence, I find it very great the fact that Prime Minister Löfven has said that we need to focus more on cyber warfare, because this is a real threat. And try to write anything about Russia, anything negative about Putin in a Swedish newspaper and post it on social media, and you get them there. And to quote Professor Christian Järner, who once encountered a troll online, I don't really understand your question, perhaps if you put it in Russian. I can understand. And it's also with the pre-war time, and it's a very valid point, no one likes war. But I also agree with the fact that we need to have the pre-war thinking in sort of our mental suitcase. Because otherwise you might end up with sort of a very Swedish disease. I've heard prominent Swedish politicians say that Sweden has always chosen peace. And then my standard reply is, well, so then Poland has always chosen war? So in that sense, we need, I mean, we had, I was fortunate enough to come of age in the era of peace and prosperity from 1989 up to 9/11. And after that, the world has changed. And we, in order to preserve the world order we tend to like, we need to realize that.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time for this panel, and I was thinking how to sum up the discussion. Actually, I must say I'm a bit stroked by the. It's on a positive note. That's my impression. If you look at the Baltic Sea region now, what several of you have emphasized is not that we are in a new Cold War and the dangers of the situation. This historical analogy of the Cold War was actually not mentioned by neither of you. Rather, you have emphasized perhaps the long-term cooperation and integration that was in the region, albeit in various constellations, one can say, and the strength that the region has right now, which I could translate into perhaps some kind of resilience also that is underlining in our societies. For what we have unprecedented now is actually this web of institutions that are embracing the Baltic Sea region, and where we cannot learn that much from history in that sense, because it is an additional layer to the states and the societal contacts that we have had, both the regional organizations, but then of course the European organizations. And perhaps that is something for the next panel to move into and see what can be the way forward, and how do we use this actually strong historical foundation that we have for the region, but also this a new situation after the Cold War, but also in a pre-war setting of the institutions that we have, and who are also which are also challenged, one can say, by Russia in this regard. So I would like for you to join me in thanking this excellent panel's participants. Thank you very much for sharing your views. Time for some coffee, and we will start again around 3 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Ja. Den ganzen Tag aber ein bisschen ich bin noch ein bisschen da. Ja. So, what nee, aber das passt. Aber ich bin noch ein bisschen da. Kaffee will ich noch trinken. Ich weiß jetzt,